The Hells Angels are one of the most famous motorcycle clubs in the world. Part of the 1%, the group first originated in California in 1948. Today, it claims over 450 chapters in 59 countries, with several movies, TV series, and books covering its history. Members of the Hells Angels have been known to escort victims of abuse to trial. The club is big on charity work, and some of its seniors have gained an almost heroic aura in recent years. But the history of the Hells Angels also has a few darker pages in its book. As the group grew in notoriety and size, it often found itself embroiled in wars and other violent conflicts, not without its fair share of the blame. Today, we'll look at 7 times the Hells Angels crossed swords with another motorcycle club and how those battles potentially shaped the club into what it is today. Number 7. The Vagos MC. Also from California, the Vagos Motorcycle Club has a pretty similar origin story to that of the Angels. Formed in 1965, the club at first welcomed mainly Vietnam War veterans and other misfits. Later labeled the Mafia on Wheels by a former informant who had infiltrated it, the Vagos spent most of the early part of their existence making a name for themselves in the criminal underworld. Alongside trafficking narcotics, the group also quickly began to specialize in money laundering, weapons, trafficking, and general violence. By the turn of the century, as the motorcycle club started expanding even more, the Vagos MC eventually stepped into Hells Angels territory. In October 2001, a violent brawl between Hells Angels and Vagos members broke out in Costa Mesa. Soon turning into a proper melee, the fight involved up to 70 people, with anything from handlebars to gas tanks being used as weapons. The Costa Mesa incident would be the first of many battles, culminating with a shootout at a casino in Sparks, Nevada about 10 years later. Known as the Nugget Casino shooting, this particular fight led to the death of Hells Angels San Jose president Jeffrey Pettigrew and to the arrest of Vagos Los Angeles vice president Gary Rudnick. Number 6. The Breed MC. Another of the 1%er clubs formed in the 1960s, the Breed MC originally hailed from Ashbury Park, a relatively small coastal city in central New Jersey. The club rapidly grew to over 3,000 members in the 70s, focusing mainly on illegal activities including selling drugs, extortion, theft, assault, and witness intimidation. New chapters also sprung up, with Breed members operating out of New York, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Their activities, boastful nature, and the unruliness of some of these breeds soon attracted the attention of the Cleveland chapter of the Hells Angels. By 1971, the two clubs were on a war footing, and when the long-awaited annual motorcycle custom and trade show finally took place in the city, the Angels drew first blood. Within a matter of minutes, 5 people were killed, and scores more were wounded in a coordinated knife attack. By the end of the night, police had arrested over 85 people, 20 of which had to be hospitalized. The 1971 motorcycle show battle would be the first of a long series of fights involving both the Hells Angels and the Breed, including a retaliatory attack in which members of the Angels lobbed grenades at the house of the Breed national president. Eventually, the Breed disbanded in 2006, following mass indictments and desertion. Among former members, many believe the feud with the Hells Angels to be one of the main reasons behind the Breed's demise. Number 5. The Pagans. Founded in Maryland in 1957, the Pagans were at first a mostly pacifist group of friends inspired by UK and European MCs. The original 13 members drove a mix of American and British bikes, wore embroidered leather and denim jackets, and looked a lot more European than many of the other clubs in existence at the time. By the end of the 1960s, however, these dissimilarities had quickly disappeared in favor of a more violent approach. In the following 2 decades, the Pagans would become associated with traditional organized crime families in multiple cities, including metropoles like Philadelphia, New York, and Pittsburgh. In the 90s were also when the Hells Angels first struck, cornering the president of the Pagans' Philadelphia chapter and shooting him 9 times at close range. Although the target survived, the first attack led to several retaliation attempts, including a raid by the Pagans on a Hells Angels-sponsored event a few years later. During the attack, 1 pagan was killed and 73 more were arrested. The feud between the Pagans and the Hells Angels continued well into the 2000s and 2010s. After a brief lull right around the first phase of the COVID pandemic, the 2 clubs have now begun warring again, with bodies and jail sentences amassing on both sides. Number 4. Sons of Satan. As one of the smaller MCs which would eventually be absorbed into the Pagans, the Sons of Satan never really faced the Hells Angels in their early years. When, in the 1970s, Sons of Satan founder John Marin eventually brokered a deal with the Pagans' leadership. However, select members of the club moved over to the new group and found themselves at the center of a growing rivalry with the Angels. Since the Angels' attacks of the 1990s, the Sons of Satan rode and often bled alongside their pagan allies. As a result, the traditional Satan's Clubhouse in Raffo, Pennsylvania, was destroyed by a pipe bomb attack in December 2002. Although investigators never found a culprit and the house was eventually rebuilt, many within the group believe the Hells Angels to be responsible. Number 3. Bandidos. The second largest motorcycle club in the world after the Angels themselves, the Bandidos were originally formed in 1966 in Houston, Texas. The club, whose name was inspired by the lives and creed of Mexican bandits raiding across the US-Mexico border, quickly attracted disgruntled Vietnam veterans, dock workers, and other members, numbering in the hundreds as soon as the 1970s. For most of the 70s and 80s, the Bandidos expanded both across the United States and Australia, with the Sydney chapter being established in 1983. This rapid expansion put them at odds with many other clubs, including the Angels, but it would be the Bandidos' arrival to Europe that led to an all-out war. By the early 1990s, Bandidos had established chapters in most of Northern Europe, including Copenhagen in Denmark, Oslo in Norway, and Helsinki in Finland. In 1994, the 2 sides started what is known as the Great Nordic Biker War, a 3-year-long conflict over territorial claims that would reshape a large chunk of Europe's attitude towards motorcycle clubs. Involving over 20 bigger and smaller clubs who resorted in anything from car bombings to drive-bys to stolen anti-tank missiles to settle their score. The conflict left 9 bikers dead and almost 100 wounded, including civilians and police officers. Although the Hells Angels and Bandidos officially brokered a peace treaty by the end of the 1990s, occasional skirmishes between the 2 clubs still happen today, with members on both sides still being arrested on assault and attempted murder charges in major cities around Europe and the US. Number 2. Mongols MC. While we covered the history of the Mongols MC when we talked about their clashes with the Mexican Mafia, the Los Angeles-based motorcycle club also had plenty of run-ins with the Hells Angels over its history. As the Mongols quickly grew in both size and power over the 70s, the Angels eventually took issue with them claiming California as their home state and adding a California rocker to their patch, something that they had exclusive rights to up until that point. The bottom rocker issue sparked a conflict that would last for the better part of the next 50 years. While the war between the two clubs has seen long ceasefires and periods of peace, the Angels still consider the Mongols one of their worst enemies, and the two have been known to come to blows quite frequently. Although most skirmishes only involve a few bikers on each side and often lead to no serious consequences, the two clubs have also been responsible for bigger outbreaks of violence. In 2002, for example, a confrontation during the annual Laughlin River Run led to the death of 2 members of the Angels and 1 Mongol. Known as the River Run Riot, this incident is also considered the first mass murder at a Nevada casino. Number 1. The Outlaws. The most famous of the Hells Angels enemies, the Outlaws, has been at odds with the California Club for as long as some of their members can remember. From the late 60s to the mid-70s, expansion within the two clubs led to the first series of clashes, with several people on both sides losing their lives as a result. The biggest fight, however, would happen in Canada and would reshape the image of both clubs for years to come. Known in the country as the First Biker War, the conflict was fought between the mid-70s and the mid-80s, originating out of a dispute over territory in both Quebec and Ontario. The war led to a total of 70 deaths, 100+ injuries, and more than 50 arrests. At some point during the war, members of the Outlaw also succeeded in killing Yves Buteau, the Angels' first national leader in Canada. In response, members of the Hells Angels started a ruthless campaign of targeted assassinations, virtually exterminating the Montreal chapter of the Outlaws. By the time the two clubs signed an international peace treaty in 1984, the Hells Angels had achieved a clear victory, consolidating power and further expanding into Canada. Conversely, the Outlaws would remain in full control of Ontario until the early 2000s.